Welcome to The Criminologist, where the complex realities of criminal justice meet transformative solutions. Join host Joseph Arvidson as he speaks with leading researchers, practitioners, and those who've lived the journey from crime to change. Together, we dive into the latest science and interventions supporting desistance and reintegration, challenging media-driven myths clouding our perceptions. Tune in to learn from true experts in the field and those who've walked the path themselves. And now, please welcome your host, Joseph Arvidson.
Hello, and welcome to episode 220 of the Criminologist Podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. This week, we are thrilled to be bringing you a very special episode of the Criminologist Podcast. Regular listeners of the program often hear me talk about our TIDES Supervision Model, the trauma-informed desistance approach that my colleague Nicole Kimberley-Staeheli and I developed. We have some really big news to share about TIDES, so close to making that announcement. But in the meantime, I thought I would revisit some of the themes of TIDES and hear not only from Nicole, but from some other practitioners who have appeared on the show in the past to really give some important context to the TIDES model, which, as you all know, if you're regular listeners, is a unique framework that Nicole and I created to bring a more compassionate, evidence-based approach to client supervision. TIDES combines trauma-informed approaches with desistance theory as well as neuroscience, providing agencies with a model that not only meets clients where they are, but also helps them forge a new positive path forward. In today's episode, we will explore some of the most impactful discussions on TIDES principles. You will hear from my co-creator, Nicole Kimberley-Staeheli, who provides powerful insights on the role of trauma in shaping client behaviors. We will also delve into desistance theory with the one and only Dr. Fergus McNeill, who shapes his expertise on narrative transformation and the journey away from crime. And finally, we will hear from friend of the show, Dr. Jerrod Brown, who will bring us a fascinating look into the science of behavior and exploring how neuroscience can enhance our recidivism reduction efforts and all the other great things that we are trying to do with the TIDES Supervision Model. Each of these perspectives highlights a fundamental piece of the TIDES framework, offering a glimpse into how this model can transform supervision. Let's begin with a foundational component of the TIDES Supervision Model, which is understanding trauma. And so, let's hear from my partner and TIDES co-creator, Nicole Kimberley-Staeheli. I love hearing how you cited James Bonta himself in his acknowledgement of ACE's literature, those adverse childhood experiences. Share a bit of that with us, please, about, again, even the co-creator, if you will, of our risk-need responsivity framework is beginning to acknowledge the importance of trauma in working with justice-involved individuals.
Okay, true confessions. I was absolutely giddy when I discovered Dr. Bonta's article, published it on LinkedIn, and it was based on, he was doing a webinar in Japan. Apparently, they just translated the psychology of criminal conduct into Japanese, right? So in the midst of this conversation he was having, they asked about the impact of trauma. And so that's where he started to talk about, the importance of the ACEs research, recognizing that we didn't have the research on adverse childhood experiences and really on trauma back when they first started creating, the principles of R&R. That research, understanding the impact on the brain, just really wasn't around yet. So in his article, he really emphasized that one thing we need to do as practitioners is to recognize if our clients have experienced adverse childhood experiences, if they truly have histories of trauma, this is going to impact how we then deliver our treatment, which our treatment, right, is CBIs. So for me, it was exciting because, well, a lot of things, but really, I spent my entire career with what I will say is like a foot in both camps. I was doing cognitive behavioral work and trauma work going on almost 20 years ago now. And oftentimes it was seen as an adversarial kind of process. You either did COG or you did trauma. You didn't talk about both. Trauma is this issue over here. And really, Nicole, if you're not a therapist, are you sure you should even be going there? Yeah, we should absolutely be going there. Because what we know from the research, and you talked about this a minute ago, Joe, right? So many of the clients we work with, clients in crisis, whether it's human services, justice system involvement, they've experienced trauma. So for me, I guess Dr. Banta's article and that kind of reflection from him of all people, that no, we need to think about trauma, we need to understand this research, and we need to take that into consideration when we're working with clients, was, I don't know, not a justification, but just it kind of showed me that all these experiences I had over the years, because when I worked with clients who did trauma work and did the COG work, it made a difference when we did both. So this really just kind of brought all that to fruition.
I have been blessed to have developed a professional relationship with Dr. Banta. And by that, I mean, he returns my emails. But to your point, I know he's always open when new editions of the Psychology of Criminal Conduct come out to review the landscape. And he has acknowledged that when the first edition came out, and I know they're just going to press with the 7th edition now, we didn't know everything we knew about trauma back then. Or to that end, I know that even stuff around the emerging desistance models was not noted in those earlier iterations of Psychology of Criminal Conduct, or by extension, the risk-need responsivity framework. And that's another thing that they're starting to take a look at. So kudos to Dr. Banta and his team, always upgrading and updating that framework. A lot of what you're going to talk about when we talk about the place of cognitive behavioral interventions and the efficacy of those interventions if we don't address trauma has to do with neuroscience, Nicole. And I don't want our listeners' eyes to gloss over. So if possible, can you begin by just maybe giving them an introductory, a 101 version of neuroscience, and then really talk about what the practitioner should at least begin to know about neuroscience as it relates to their clients?
All right, so that phrase neuroscience can sound a little intimidating, right? Basically, what it's referring to is just how our brain functions, how our nervous system functions, how these things work together. But here's the thing. With the clients we work with, there's a couple of things we really need to be aware of. Because again, our clients have experienced significant trauma. We know this. We know this from an insane amount of research for over many, many years. Trauma impacts how our brains function. And so I think as we really dive into looking at this crossroads of trauma-informed work in COG, what are we talking about in COG? We're talking about how we think, how we can recognize our thinking. So we need to understand, though, that for our clients, there's some challenges. And essentially, when we think about it, when we're overwhelmed by a traumatic experience, when we've been unable to keep ourselves safe, our autonomic nervous system kicks in and we react. Fight, flight, freeze mode, right? We've all heard of that. It's an adaptive reaction to keep ourselves safe. But what happens for clients who have experienced a lot of trauma and haven't been able to resolve those experiences is that adaptive state really becomes more of, and this is Dr. Bruce Perry's language, but maladaptive traits, ways of living, ways of being, ways of surviving that our clients don't even recognize. So if we're in this state, essentially what we're talking about is that we get stuck in that kind of reactive fight, flight, and freeze mode. So when that happens, our clients experience higher levels of chemicals in their brains. They're hypervigilant. They're always on the outlook for a threat because, again, they've learned the world isn't safe, right? So if their brains are in this kind of elevated state, it doesn't take much for a trauma reaction to kick in. The other piece we really want to understand from a neuroscience perspective and working with our clients is many of them have experienced, again, those adverse childhood experiences we talked about. So it's not just about the present day reactions, but it's how those past experiences have impacted how their brains develop. So for many of the clients we're working with, they have a lot of really strong neural connections back in the reptilian part of the brain that is responsible for reacting to threat. They have fewer connections in the amygdala, which means they struggle to manage their emotions, and even fewer connections still up in this frontal cortex, that executive functioning center of our brain, right? Where we can think rationally and abstractly, when we can think about long-term consequences, when we can be creative. So it's not to say that there's something wrong with how their brains develop, they just develop differently based on the need to keep themselves safe. That really impacts our clients and how we interact with them today.
Thank you for that, Nicole. And friends, if you would like to hear that interview in its entirety, that was actually a snippet from episode 146 of the Criminologist Podcast, entitled The Effects of Trauma in the Delivery of Cognitive Behavioral Interventions, with Nicole Kimberley-Staeheli. Check it out. And so, with a foundation in trauma-informed approaches, we now turn to desistance theory, which explores the process of moving away from crime and building a new identity. This theory isn't just about risk management, it's about transformation. In episode 76 of the Criminologist Podcast, I had the privilege of speaking with Dr. Fergus McNeill, one of the world's foremost experts in desistance theory. In this segment, Fergus is going to talk about the various definitions of desistance, ranging from primary to secondary to tertiary, and some other really fascinating things which I cannot wait to share with you. So let's hear a little bit of my previous interview with Fergus McNeill from episode 76.
Nowadays, I would use a different three-part framework. So Steve and Shad came up with the distinction between primary and secondary desistance, which basically matches the distinction between primary and secondary deviance. So primary refers to the act itself, or in the case of desistance, the absence of the act. But secondary refers to an underlying shift in identity associated with a change in behaviour. So whereas secondary deviance is about internalizing the label as an offender or as a drug user or whatever else, secondary desistance is about coming to see yourself as different from who you've been in the past. And I added to their framework a third level or layer, which is tertiary desistance, and that refers to the development of a sense of belonging in a community. So you can have behaviour change, you can have identity change, but if the identity change isn't recognised and supported and even celebrated by people around you, then it stays vulnerable and fragile. So that to me, to seal the deal of desistance is to find a community within which you're accepted as a desister.
Yeah, and I'm familiar with those demarcations, if you will, as well, which really leads to my next question here. When I speak of primary and secondary desistance, again, it's sort of that behavioral is that first level, if you will, which we're still hung up on in the U.S. We obsess on recidivism rates. In the United States, we try to utilize the risk-need responsivity approach, but the unfortunate reality is that we're still very much a containment model, in my opinion. So to what degree do you think there are deeper systemic or cultural differences between the United States and the United Kingdom in which that ground just may simply be more fertile on your side of the Atlantic for desistance to take hold?
Yeah, I think in Scotland specifically, and in Ireland actually, people who work in probation and parole are still trained as social workers in the first instance. In England and Wales, it's different. They do a different, more specialised, more criminal justice focused form of training. But historically, probation work in the UK has been rooted in social work and a close sibling of it. In the States, although there is as I understand it, a sub-discipline of forensic or correctional social work, most people that are working in client-facing criminal justice functions, in correctional services, I guess, are not social work trained. And I understand that there's a lot of variety across the different states of the United States, but from what I've learned about it from the literature and from conversations with colleagues in North America, it's been a massive effort to move from a central preoccupation with control and law enforcement towards any kind of re-engagement with the process of trying to support people to change, basically, and also trying to support them in ways which extend beyond individual or personal change, but also go beyond into community contexts and trying to create climates and cultures within which it's possible to lead different lives.
Yeah, lots of work to do, which is why I'm always excited to talk to individuals such as yourself so we can learn more and hopefully change the way we do business. I was excited to note you were coming on the show. I asked my listeners for any questions that they may want to ask of you. This question is from Ed in Minneapolis, who wants to know, what are some of the big issues currently or questions for desistance theory and research? That is, what direction do you feel the field may be headed here as we move into the 21st century?
Yeah, I think there's two or three things I would pick out. One is about the diversification of desistance research. So, like much of criminology, I think there's a legitimate criticism of desistance research that it's been preoccupied with the experience of mostly young white men, mostly in the USA and the UK, and that diversifying that in terms of cultural diversity, different minority ethnic communities is important. Diversifying it in terms of gender is crucially important because we are learning that desistance is different for women. And also, we're only beginning to see the development of desistance research in the global south, and that's really interesting, where different state civil society formations create different assets and liabilities in relation to supporting desistance. So there's a kind of southern criminology angle on desistance, which I think we need to see develop as soon as possible. The other thing I would say, though, I think for me the most fundamental challenge to desistance research has emerged from within desistance research. Let me try and explain this. I think the more that I study desistance, the more that I think the real problem is criminalization, not crime. I'm not saying that crime isn't a real problem, but I think that the ways that we respond to crime through criminalization and penalization are so counterproductive that often what people need to desist from is criminal justice involvement. So it's not just about, or even centrally about, a change in their behaviour. It's about whether or not the criminal justice system is ever going to let them go, and if so, under what conditions.
I'm going to struggle to complete the interview now, Fergus, because that just blew my mind and I could just sit and reflect on that. I'm going to circle back to that theme here in a second, but just a quick follow-up question that Ed had was, and you noted this in speaking with your North American context, there are pockets of hope, to coin a phrase here in the U.S., for more progressive agencies that are introducing their staff to the theory of desistance and some of those fledgling interventions. So what are things that probation and parole officers can do in their daily practice to promote desistance with their clients? Shy of some agency-wide introduction of a new practice model or anything like that, but just something that a progressive-minded PO who might be listening can say, Dr. McNeill, what can I start doing in my daily practice with my caseload to promote desistance in the folks I work with?
Well, I think it begins with recognition of the worth of every individual. Alison Liebling would say the same about trying to rethink how we approach people who are going through imprisonment, that we begin with recognition and communication of moral worth, and that sounds kind of abstract, maybe a little bit airy-fairy, but there's nothing more important in supporting desistance, as far as I understand it, than establishing a relationship within which change and supporting change is enabled. And that's a kind of reciprocal process where trust emerges and develops and is tested and retested. So a good PO needs to understand the centrality of the relationship and the kind of qualities that they need to build into the relationship. They need to understand that the process is a complicated and difficult one, and that there will be setbacks. People who are in established or entrenched patterns of behaviour won't easily change them, so setbacks and lapses are to be expected, and the question is not will they happen, but rather how will we manage them when they happen. Then I would say it's about respect for individuality and diversity. We need to understand that although there are general patterns, everyone's desistance journey is different. And one of the PO's tasks is to understand that individual in their context, and to try to kind of do an inventory, if you like, of what personal resources and attributes and assets they have that might enable progress, and also what community assets and resources are available to them, maybe in the family or the extended family, or in faith communities, or in communities of interest built around any legal activity, let's say. So that kind of inventory building that respects the individuality of the process for different people. Other things, the communication of hope and belief in the possibility of change is really very important, and that links to the importance of agency in desistance processes, people discovering the sense that they can guide and direct their own lives, and that's easier to do if you're being supported by someone who tries to work with you in partnership rather than trying to do things to you. And, one of the worst things you can do to people is try to fix them. Whatever the Coldplay song says, it doesn't, to be treated by somebody in that way is actually to be stigmatized. It's to say you are faulty and I am not, and I can fix you because I'm all right, but you're not, which is the opposite, really, of what we're trying to communicate in respect of desistance, which is about the recognition of worth and human potential. So then it's reinforcement, it's celebration of small steps, it's advocacy work to make connections, to constructive community connections, all of those things. So it's about the way that the individual is conceived, respected and valued. It's about the way that they are seen within a network of social relations, and it's about the thoughtful attempt to pull those resources, individual and social, together to support the journey.
Wow, so many amazing truth bombs in that short segment of episode 76 of the Criminologist Podcast. I encourage you all, go back, listen to episode 76 with Dr. Fergus McNeill in its entirety, and learn so much about desistance theory, and also gain an insight into many of the themes that we are wrapping up in our TIDES Supervision Model. Indeed, as we deepen our understanding of trauma-informed approaches and desistance theory, let's take a closer look at how these principles come together within the TIDES model. In episode 197, we explored how trauma-informed approaches don't just improve individual engagement, it can also enhance overall efficacy within correctional environments. Now, in this next segment, we discuss how TIDES uses trauma awareness to create a safer, more effective framework for supervision. Let's return and have another listen to the wisdom of our TIDES co-creator, Nicole Kimberley-Staeheli.
So that phrase neuroscience can sound a little intimidating, right? Basically, what it's referring to is just how our brain functions, how our nervous system functions, how these things work together. But here's the thing. With the clients we work with, there's a couple of things we really need to be aware of. Because again, our clients have experienced significant trauma. We know this. We know this from an insane amount of research for over many, many years. Trauma impacts how our brains function. And so I think as we really dive into looking at this crossroads of trauma-informed work in COG, what are we talking about in COG? We're talking about how we think, how we can recognize our thinking. So we need to understand, though, that for our clients, there's some challenges. And essentially, when we think about it, when we're overwhelmed by a traumatic experience, when we've been unable to keep ourselves safe, our autonomic nervous system kicks in and we react. Fight, flight, freeze mode, right? We've all heard of that. It's an adaptive reaction to keep ourselves safe. But what happens for clients who have experienced a lot of trauma and haven't been able to resolve those experiences is that adaptive state really becomes more of, and this is Dr. Bruce Perry's language, but maladaptive traits, ways of living, ways of being, ways of surviving that our clients don't even recognize. So if we're in this state, essentially what we're talking about is that we get stuck in that kind of reactive fight, flight, and freeze mode. So when that happens, our clients experience higher levels of chemicals in their brains. They're hypervigilant. They're always on the outlook for a threat. Because again, they've learned the world isn't safe, right? So if their brains are in this kind of elevated state, it doesn't take much for a trauma reaction to kick in. The other piece we really want to understand from a neuroscience perspective and working with our clients is many of them have experienced, again, those adverse childhood experiences we talked about. So it's not just about the present day reactions, but it's how those past experiences have impacted how their brains develop. So for many of the clients we're working with, they have a lot of really strong neural connections back in the reptilian part of the brain that is responsible for reacting to threat. They have fewer connections in the amygdala, which means they struggle to manage their emotions, and even fewer connections still up in this frontal cortex, that executive functioning center of our brain, right? Where we can think rationally and abstractly, when we can think about long-term consequences, when we can be creative. So it's not to say that there's something wrong with how their brains develop, they just develop differently based on the need to keep themselves safe. That really impacts our clients and how we interact with them today.
I have learned so much from our mutual friend and friend of the podcast, Dr. Jerrod Brown, about neurocriminology and neuroscience. And the more I reflect on it, Nicole, and I'm sure you'll agree, I realize it's just such a travesty that we're not training even on an introductory level this to our practitioners who we expect to implement these cognitive behavioral interventions without having that basic backdrop. I think the good news is, and you'd probably agree, as a field, we are moving closer to getting the practitioner, the probation parole officer, to understand the impact and the efficacy of cognitive interventions. But as you point out, that all rests upon certain assumptions, which our probation officers, if they're not aware of the neuroscience, just aren't aware. It's almost a really crude analogy, but it's almost like, okay, great, we've got you all practicing a certain medical procedure, but if we didn't tell you that 20% of your patients have an allergy that the medication won't take, what's the point? And if we leave them in the dark about trauma and about that brain science, we're really doing a disservice to those POs who think they're doing a bang-up job because they're adhering to the research around cognitive behavioral interventions. So to that end, share some of your insights on the role, we'll stay on the brain path here, the role of the frontal cortex in the human brain, and more to the point, the implications for effective cognitive behavioral interventions.
Well, I first just want to say, I don't think that was a crude analogy. I think it was a really good analogy, except that I would flip your statistics. 80% of our clients versus 20, because we know research on trauma, anywhere from 75 to 95% of our clients have experienced significant trauma. So we're really talking about the majority of the clients that we're working with, at least within the justice system, right? So just to throw that out there. But the other piece of that too is then for the practitioner, and I promise I'll circle back around to the frontal cortex, I promise. But for the practitioner who is facilitating cognitive behavioral interventions, they're following the programs, they've been trained, they're building working alliances, and that they still feel like this isn't effective. Why isn't it working better? Why are my clients struggling so much? That kind of gap, that's where I think this information can help us understand that. And by shifting our perspective, even just in some small ways, and introducing some additional ways of using cognitive behavioral interventions through that lens of trauma, I think we can make a big difference. We can make a big change. So I guess I share that at this point to say that's why I think this information on neuroscience and understanding some of these pieces we're talking about is so important, right? So basically, when you think about what I described in terms of how trauma's impacted the brain, it also impacts how we process information. That's the reality for many of our clients. If they spend a lot of time in this reptilian part of their brain, if they are in a very reactive mode, if their brains have learned that we need to keep ourselves safe, if that is the first reaction, what happens when we're hijacked, and it's really what it is, when we're in that reptilian part of our brain, we can't access the frontal cortex. We can't get to the executive functioning center of our brain, that very space where all of this cog work takes place. Our ability to access the frontal cortex really goes offline when we are triggered, when we're reacting, when we're experiencing some of those trauma reactions. So that's maybe an extreme, right? That's when the client is truly re-traumatized. Even if that doesn't happen, because I've had that question. Well, Nicole, you're saying every time a client is struggling to figure something out or to understand this concept, they're experiencing a trauma reaction. Not necessarily. But what happens for all of us really in our brains is our ability to access that frontal cortex is hinged on our abilities to manage and regulate our emotions. So the more elevated we are, the more fearful we are, the more of a state of alarm, or even on kind of high alert, the more we're going to struggle, even every day, to, again, stay focused in that frontal cortex. So basically, if you ever just think about it, you ever had a day where you were just really struggling? Maybe multitasking, maybe you had, a sick partner or something was going on in your home life. And then you add to that, maybe you had a packed day of clients, and it felt like every client coming in was struggling. Every client had a god-awful story to tell, or every client was really just kind of combatant with you. And throughout the day, you maybe feel like you're just getting more and more frustrated, feeling more and more overwhelmed. Your levels of stress are going up higher and higher. That impacts all of us, and that impacts how we process information. So the more elevated those stress levels are, those arousal levels are, the more we struggle to, again, stay focused with our executive functioning center. So for all of us, we fall into automatic thinking. We start to get very concrete. We start to maybe get tunnel vision this way or that way. We get more reactive as the arousal levels in our brains adjust to the life circumstances we're dealing with. So it's not just for our clients, it's really for all of us.
Great job, Nicole, talking about the body-brain connection and the introduction of neuroscience awareness. We're going to wrap this episode up talking to friend of the show, Dr. Jerrod Brown, more about the neuroscience aspect of and how it relates to our TIDES model. But let me just say this. Our TIDES Supervision Model is predicated on 3 theoretical frameworks, if you will. Desistance Theory, trauma-informed awareness, and neuroscience. And so we've bundled these 3, like I said, 3 theoretical frameworks into the TIDES model. And in this last segment, Dr. Brown is going to do a really good job talking about how we really do need to take a more holistic view of the populations we serve, up to and including, among other things, neuroscience awareness. So let's have a listen to friend of the show, Dr. Jerrod Brown.
You bet. So we'll look at this through the lens of neurocriminology, but we'll also be pulling in some forensic neuroscience, some psychoneuroimmunology research, and a little bit on neurocounseling research too. And I'm going to weave that into today's talk. But if you haven't heard any of my talks on neurocriminology, really think of it as it's a subset of the field of criminology. It's a subdiscipline, but it's pulling in research from neuroscience, biology, genetics, neuroimaging, biochemistry, all of these things, psychophysiology, and then helping us better understand the family factors, the social dynamics, all the environmental things that I think a lot of you probably have the traditional training on. When we look at this research of neurocriminology, we're typically going to be in a better position to understand the neurological, the biological, the social, and the emotional factors associated with criminality. And it takes into account prenatal factors. We talk a lot about that. Joe and I have just really understanding a lot of these things may have origins in the prenatal world. So it's very important to consider prenatal factors. We'll talk about that today. I'll talk about the biopsychosocial model as well, why we need to be aware of that. But if you're studying neurocriminology literature, under that umbrella, it talks about nutritional deficiencies, malnutrition, pregnancy-related factors. It talks about head trauma, prefrontal cortex damage, the amygdala, biochemistry factors, what's going on in our body biochemically. I'll talk today about blood sugar dysregulation, glucose issues. Why in the world do you want to care about that? You're going to care about that after you hear me talk today. I really believe that. It's just fascinating stuff. Neurocriminology literature takes into account neuroendocrine factors, so like hormones, the HPA axis. If you've listened to enough podcasts, you've probably heard me talk about that a million times now. But also, it's just as important to really understand attachment, trauma, the impact that poverty has. The list goes on and on and on. So those are just a few of the topics that would fall under the umbrella of neurocriminology. If you study neuroscience, so if we pull some neuroscience literature in here, it's really taking into account crime-related factors through a neuroscience lens. So really understanding how neuroscience literature intersects with the law and the criminal justice system. It studies criminal behavior. It would study psychopathy, antisocial behavior. Forensic neuroscience has a lot to do with studying like brain structure abnormalities. It has a lot to do with understanding emotional dysregulation, cognitive biases, empathy-related problems, and the list goes on. And if you study forensics, you look at some of the forensic literature, it talks about the importance of truly understanding self-regulation deficits. It talks a lot about understanding fear responses and the lack thereof. So if you study neurocriminology, you probably have come across like fearlessness theory. That's something you'd want to be aware of. These would be clients that typically don't have a fear response to certain things, which is not a good thing. It talks a lot about empathy and morality and social decision-making, to name a few. And if we weave in psychoneuroimmunology into this, I know we're throwing a lot at you right now, but psychoneuroimmunology is a multidisciplinary field of study that helps us better understand the mind-body spectrum. So it takes into account our behavior, our brain, and the immune system and inflammatory responses in our body. The research is very clear that people who are in prison on long-term probation typically have poor health outcomes. They eat not well, they don't sleep, Obesity problems have been noted to be higher in some of those populations. If you look at some of the research on just health factors in prison, a lot of clients end up coming out of prison more metabolically unhealthy. There are a lot of reasons for that. Maybe they don't move a lot and there's sedentary behaviors. The food that's often served in prisons around the country are typically not that healthy for an individual. So psychoneuroimmunology takes into account the brain, the body, the interconnectedness between our immune system, how emotions impact that, how social factors impact that, as well as behavioral factors. And then the other area of study that I really draw from is neurocounseling. Maybe you're not a counselor or therapist, still learning about neurocounseling literature can be very helpful. Neurocounseling is really infusing neuroscience into counseling practice. But if you're a case manager, infusing that into case management work or probation officer, studying neurocounseling literature, you're going to be studying the central nervous system, the brain, how it relates to our body, our mood, our behaviors. It takes into account biological factors, neurological, psychological, social, and physiological factors. When I look at these these four big areas of study, I see a lot of overlap. They look at it maybe through different directions, but there's a lot of overlap too between neurocriminology, psychoneuroimmunology, and neurocounseling. It's very important if you truly want to dig deep into the weeds with understanding like neuroscience literature. Looking at these three big areas of study can be very, very helpful. And before I kick it back to you, Joe, I know I'm throwing a lot out at the folks. When we're looking at this topic today through that neuro-bio-psychosocial lens, if we infuse neurocriminology into this equation, it really studies how biochemical abnormalities like hormone dysfunctions may play a role in criminal behavior. Some of the research talks about higher levels of testosterone, particularly maybe being a factor to take into account. It takes into account head injuries, poor nutrition, trauma histories, prenatal drug and alcohol exposure, chemical sensitivities, foods, endocrine disruptors, so environmental contaminants. So maybe someone's exposed to a bunch of lead or mercury or pesticides. These are all some of the neurobiopsychosocial factors to take into account through a neurocriminology lens.
Thank you, Dr. Brown, and thank you all for joining me on this special best of, if you will, episode of the Criminologist Podcast, where we explored the transformative potential of the TIDES Supervision Model. I hope you enjoyed these highlights and gained new insights into how trauma-informed awareness, desistance theory, and neuroscience can elevate our approaches to supervision. I will be back in a couple of weeks with a fresh episode. In the meantime, if today's discussion sparked your interest in learning more about the TIDES Supervision Model, I will leave contact information in the episode description of this program. That will include our TIDES website, as well as a reminder of how you may contact us directly via our TIDES Gmail. You may also reach out to the podcast directly via email at thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. That's thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. Be sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram at The Criminologist Podcast. New fun images are being added all the time to those feeds. You don't want to miss out. We are also on Twitter. Give us a follow at Crim Media Group. That's CRIM Media Group. And of course, you may contact me, Joseph Arvidson, on LinkedIn, and follow both the Criminologist Podcast and the Paragon Group on our LinkedIn pages. Hey, lastly, if you've not already done so, subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Criminologist, where we post additional content related to the themes of this podcast. And if you believe in what we're doing on the show, if you're part of the movement, please spread the word, tell a friend or a coworker or a colleague about us. Ask them to subscribe to the podcast and do so yourself if you've not already done so. And always remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us.
The Criminologist Podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, or training opportunities, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. If you enjoyed the show, you can find more content and videos on our YouTube channel, The Criminologist. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Both the Criminologist Podcast and the Criminologist channel are brought to you by the Criminologist Media Group. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.